So, Lisa, do you normally have a break in the middle, or do you go straight through?
What I understand is only straight through.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. No, it's just what people are expected to. My students get very restless if they don't get a break after 45 minutes.
The thing is, sí. Ahora sí. Ya empezamos, ya son las 11:10. Hola, buenos días a todos y a todas. Muy bienvenidos al primer seminario en el ciclo de seminarios sobre el diálogo empírico en derechos humanos. Mi nombre es Siri Gloppen y yo soy profesora aquí dentro del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales y la coordinadora del proyecto de investigación DRIVERS, un proyecto financiado por la Comisión Europea, the European Research Council, que empezó en mayo de este año y corre por 5 años hasta abril. I'm going to switch over into English now, if you don't mind. So, welcome again. Welcome to this first seminar in a cycle of seminars that the Rivers Project is organizing. This is a first seminar in a cycle of 4 seminars on empirical dialogues and human rights. And it's connected with the Rivers Project, because the Rivers Project will work the next 5 years on issues as water, indigenous people rights. We're going to work in the United Nations, in Colombia and Nepal, and it cross-cuts actually the fields of human rights and anthropology. And the project has a very bottom-up approach. I'm not going to enter too much in the project as such because we're going to launch it next month in November. We have several activities between the 6th and the 8th of November, seminars in Spanish, also in English. We have several international guests that's going to join us for the launch. Amongst others, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People Rights, the chair of the UN Forum on Indigenous People Issues. We have an indigenous judge from the special jurisdiction on peace in Colombia, and also the deputy representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the Colombian office. I'm extremely grateful that also other colleagues at Carlos III, the university, joined this seminar cycle that we are organizing. As you have seen, it is organized in collaboration with the Institute of Human Rights, also with the PhD program on human rights. Actually, if the PhD students participate in the 4 sessions, then you will be able to have a certificate, and that will count as a credit in your program. This seminar is also co-organized with the Grupo de Investigación del Derecho y la Justicia. And why we are organizing this seminar cycle as actually the first public activity of Rivers is we have a little leaflet that will be available on the website of Rivers and also on Facebook, where you're going to have an overview of the 4 seminars. And the seminar cycle has actually as a goal to create a space for dialogue between legal scholars and social scientists to discuss empirical approaches and more theoretical approaches to different topics of human rights. That's why that we opted to have a bit more informal setup, but I didn't realize that here in this room, so the chairs are on rolls, so it seemed that we got a rolling in every session. But it's to have that more open space between the international guests that are going to have a seminar and all the participants. So the seminar cycle wants to contribute what is called in literature the empirical turn in international human rights studies. And why is this actually the first topic of this 5-year project? Well, I would like to share a little an anecdote from my own research experience. So I'm originally from Belgium. I'm trained in criminology, then I did a master in anthropology, and then I ended up in the law faculty in the Institute of Human Rights. That's already 15 years ago, and I did my PhD on transitional justice from a legal anthropological perspective. However, all my colleagues were legal scholars, and I was sharing my office with my colleagues from constitutional law, Belgium constitutional law. So when I was sharing with them that I would go to Guatemala, because that was my main case study, to do empirical research, to talk with the survivors of the genocide, to do interviews, focus groups, participant observation, and so on, one of my main colleagues said, but Lieselot, you need to do serious research. You're doing a PhD. And I was quite impressed. And then I started to realize that indeed for many of my colleagues at the law department, the concept of research methods and research design and research questions, that was not really part of their training, not even part from their own research projects. And while they are much more focused on more desk research, on the analysis of doctrine, on the analysis of rulings and jurisprudence. So I have to say that over the years I had a very interesting conversations with my colleagues, and also after my PhD, I started to work in Ecuador in the High Commission for Human Rights. And actually during those years, I had the Constitution of Ecuador every day next to me, because we were giving a technical advice to the Ministry of Justice and to the Assembly. And it was actually the first time that I had the Constitution constantly next to me, and still remember all the articles that we need to discuss, because at that moment it was during the administration of Korea I was there between 2010 and 2013. So it was huge debates with many of my colleagues about the implementation of the new Constitution. So I have found it over the years always a fascinating debate with legal scholars and with political scientists and anthropologists about, international human rights law doesn't matter at the local level. And how can we measure it, and how can we discuss if all those human rights actually function and actually reply to the needs of the people. So just to explain why we are organizing this as a first activity within the ERC project. And we have four seminars planned. So the first seminar is today with Siri Gloppen, who I invited to give a more general overview about that encounter between human rights, legal scholars, international law scholars, and social scientists. And she will share a couple of the research projects that she has been coordinating about different topics. Then the second seminar is in November, and there is coming Bert Ingelare, who is a social anthropologist and based at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And he has been working many years on genocide in Rwanda, on the Gacaca, which has been, well, labeled as the major legal experiment of mobilizing traditional justice system and dealing with the aftermath of a genocide. And he has been working years and years and years doing field research, also with field assistants. And he's going to share his experience on how doing field research with war survivors, the African context, and also focusing a bit more on mixed methods and life stories. Then the third seminar is a colleague and team member of the Rivers Project, Paulo, who will share his research that he did during his PhD, and sharing with us his experience as a legal scholar regarding how to do legal, how to do more ethnographic research regarding indigenous people rights. And then finally, this third one is in December in the beginning, and then the last one, which I don't see where it is on the here on the flyer, is in January, and Silvia Rodriguez Maiso, who's going to join us. She is Spanish, but she's based in the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And she has been working as a political scientist since many years on the topics of racism and discrimination, Islamophobia, and in Portugal, in Spain, but also in Latin America. Actually, she's now coordinating a Consolidator ERC grant. And one of the research lines in that research project of her is how police violence towards black people, of people of color, in Latin America and also in Spain and Portugal is actually brought to court, and to what extent the legal concept of racism and discrimination is being legally made hard, to put it like that. So she's going to share her research on that. She works mainly from a decolonial perspective, so that will be a very interesting approach too. So now we're going to introduce our speaker of today, Siri, and I'm extremely happy that she accepted the invitation to come here today as the first speaker of the seminar cycle. We met recently in Norway because she invited us to present the Rivers Project and the Bergen Exchanges. So Siri is professor of political science at the University of Bergen and also the director of the Center on Law and Social Transformations. And since a couple of years, they organize every year in August Bergen Exchanges, inviting researchers from different parts of the world connected with the different research projects that they are organizing. And this year, the Bergen Exchanges was on indigenous people rights, women rights, and extractivism. So that was a wonderful opportunity for us to go and to share the project. We went together with Marta. Where is Marta? She just left. Also Vanessa joined us, who is now doing a master thesis and master on human rights, on the right to water. And one of the participants of the Bergen Exchanges was UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation. So that was a wonderful meeting. And there was the idea to continue with this kind of exchanges and dialogues. So I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You can hear me with this, or should I use the other one? No.
I don't know. If you want to stand up, you will.
Yeah, then I'll go. Yeah. So I'll sit.
I will leave it.
Yeah. So I'll sit for now.
I'm very, can't really see you. I'm really happy to be here and to be invited to talk about empirical methods in investigating human rights and multi-method research. This has been, for me, very close to my heart, actually, since I was a master's student, because, so I come from political science. And at the time when, many decades ago, when I was a student, the political science was even more behavioralist than today. So when I was interested in investigating issues of constitutions and courts, this was seen as hopelessly old-fashioned and not really something to be studied seriously, because and I realized sort of over time that when political scientists study law, they're not really concerned with law in the sense that lawyers think about law. So when lawyers think about law, it is the normative content of the law that is the focus. And so lawyers are interested in what the law is and what the law should be. So it's a doctrine, it's jurisprudence, and this is in a way invisible for political scientists. When political scientists look at law, constitutions, court judgments, it's a lot more about extra legal factors that explains these decisions, and it's about what the incentives that law creates in the world and the results that it have. And to me, when I interviewed, I did my master thesis on constitution making in South Africa, and then I did my PhD on the new constitutional court in South Africa that was just starting to operate. And when I interviewed the judges, I realized that I was asking really inappropriate questions, because I was interviewing them from my perspective as a political scientist when I saw them as strategic actors who sort of were interested in establishing their institution in a difficult political environment, and that they were sort of acting strategically in that regard, which I thought they should. I mean, that was their job. And I still think they did, but from their perspective, that was sort of investigating. It was alleging that they did something inappropriate, because of course they just did what the law required. They just interpreted the law. So if that had the effect of establishing the institution, that was a fortunate thing, but it was not the intention to start with. And I think, so for me, this started this really sort of thinking about what is it that we as social scientists don't really get about the law, and why is it that lawyers don't really get the political implications of law and the the role of social dynamics in shaping the law. Why don't we really meet? Even when we research the same issues, we don't really meet. So this is why I, together with colleagues who are lawyers and who are social scientists of different kinds from across the world, have, and particularly from Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, but also from the US and from Europe, why we've sort of had this discussion over many years, trying to find ways to research issues of law and human rights in ways that both take into account the inside perspective from law and the outside perspective on law that the social sciences can offer. And that is also why 5 years ago we established the Center on Law and Social Transformation, which is a collaboration between the University of Bergen, cross-faculty, and the Christian Michelsen Institute, CMI, which is a development research, interdisciplinary development research institute with a human rights program since 1983, why we developed this Center on Law and Social Transformation, where the main purpose of the center is to be a platform for dialogue, but also to have research that looks at ways of investigating both the political uses of law and law as a political instrument in different ways, but also effects of law in different contexts. So I'm going to, because Liselott asked me to also say something about the center and can I just upload the page? Oh. No, it's just I'm really clumsy. See if I can find it. Then you can, if it works. Yeah. So this is the center, and we have, as you can see, we have research on many different areas: child rights, corruption and criminal law, courts, transitional justice and judicial behavior, democracy and law, gender, sexuality and the law, a lot of different projects that I'll come back to, health and law, inequality and effects of law, migration, natural resources and climate lawfare, which also has indigenous rights, and then a special section on rethinking academia and learning. But so there are a lot of researchers from across the world who are affiliated to the center, and we have sort of a lot of international research projects that different people are. So it's a loose network. So these projects also have different homes. And then we have every year that I wanted to show you. We have the Bergen exchanges every year, which is this, as Liselott was saying, it is this, in a way, research festival that runs over a week, where we have about 30 public events and social events, and where different research projects meet and discuss issues of common concern around methods, but also presenting work to each other. We have keynote lectures from people who have something important to bring. And this is also the core of a PhD course that runs every year on effects of lawfare, where there are some days in the week before, with intense teaching around the theories of legal mobilization and researching effects. And then there are readings connected with the different parts of the Bergen exchanges. And then there are workshops around the let me see. So, and as you'll see next year, this core of the Bergen exchanges will be on inequality and law. So it will be quite broad, but there will be main emphasis on inequality of law with regard to migration. That will be one emphasis, and also relating to democracy and inequality and democratic backlash. So, and then there will also be a sort of a meeting of political scientists focusing on public laws in relation to the Bergen exchanges. So if any of you are interested, you can sort of watch out. You can consult the webpage, and there will be a call for the PhD course in January. Was that more or less what you were thinking I should say? Okay, thank you. And then I wanted, before I start proper, I also wanted to know a little bit about who you are. So I'm just going to ask some questions. So, how many of you are from the master course, from Liselott's master course? You can stand up, and I'll see you clearly. So quite a few. Good. How many of you have a background in law? Yes, very good. So how many of you are from outside of Spain? Almost all. How many of you are from Latin America? Almost all. Very good. So, how many of you are anthropologists, have anthropological training? How many of you have a background in other social sciences? Good, very good. So, Great. So, how many of you have at any point done any empirical research? Good. So, I'm going to ask you now. So, what have you done?
Well, I work in an NGO with a lot of anthropologists, and we signed these research instruments, and we did like interviews in Colombian jails in order to see the violence related to drug use in jails.
Very interesting. When was this?
This was last year.
Wow. I'd like to hear more about that afterwards. Perfect. No, so we'll just ask the ones who have, others who have experience in empirical research.
Hello, I'm an economist. I'm from Peru, and I used to work for the Ministry of Economics in my country. So we made two surveys, but they were for entrepreneurs or firms about informality. That was not about human rights, but I thought that informality is like...
No, absolutely, and very relevant. So you've designed and done,
team, right?
yeah. But you've been part of designing surveys,
Yeah.
and analyzing surveys.
Yeah.
Perfect. And on informality, which is of course very important. Mm. Anybody else?
I don't know if it's working. Oh, yeah.
It is.
Okay, so I studied sociology, and then I did a master's in international relations, and initiated my PhD program in social anthropology, but I switched, so I haven't finished my research. But I have done empirical research in northern Uganda with women who were recruited by armed forces.
So qualitative research?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marta. I'm from Brazil. I work on Defensoria Pública.
On
Defensoria Pública. Es como Defensor del Pueblo, pero con distinciones. And I work with people that had been contaminated with switch to English. It's so hard.
But just say.
Heavy metals.
Yeah.
And we are doing research because there is no the protocol of health that government should do. There is no it's not being done. And my institutional is working on that.
So which methods are you using for the research?
It's on the beginning.
Yeah. So you're just designing it?
Yes.
Very interesting.
Hello, I'm Carolina. I'm from Brazil. I'm a criminal lawyer, and I also went to the history school. And at the university, I had a research about the desire of the prisoners in Brazil if they really want to vote. And we just try to find a way to make a structure for them to vote, because in Brazil, if they're not, they don't have a final condition, they can vote for it, but the state doesn't give any kind of a structure for them, so they don't vote at all. So we just research about if they really want to do it, and that was it.
So how did you do the research?
Actually, we went to some prisons over there, like 5 prisons, and we had a study, a qualitative research study inside of it, and we talk about it, and most of them really want to vote.
Interesting. Anybody else who didn't share? So this is excellent. So there is so much expertise actually in this room that's going to be amazing. You're going to help. So I think we can have a very good discussion. So what I wanted to do was that I'll just say a little bit at the beginning, and I know this will be very, for some of you, this will be very, very basic. For some of you, it might, I don't think it will be difficult for any of you, but if you have any questions, you could just ask, because this is just a basic introduction into different types of research methods. And then what I wanted to do is that I'll sort of share with you some of our research projects that we've had over the past years, and then I want to share the main question, and then I want you to help me think about what type of research would be interesting, and then I'll say a little bit about what we did. So we often, maybe I'll just go back. It's not that. Yeah. So. Yeah, this I already said. So in when we think about, or maybe I'll go back to this one. So I think when we do empirical research into law, we have different types of knowledge interests that we want. There are different things we want to know. So at the very basic level, one of the things we want to know when we research law in different contexts. So many of our projects are multi-sited. We look at different cases and how the same issue is playing out in different cases. So one of the things that we're interested in knowing is how human rights, for instance, is understood in different contexts. What different it can be in different countries, but it can be also among different groups. For this, I mean, that is, of course, very central to the Rivers Project. It is how do different groups in different society think about the right to water? What does it mean to them? Or what does water mean, in a sense? What's the social function and the social meaning? And so to understand the meaning of law, is one of the important empirical questions that we ask in empirically related human rights research. So interpretative research is very central, and this can, of course, be researched in different ways, but often we do this through qualitative research. So some of you have been involved in that, anthropological research, where you can use different types of methods. Often anthropology, sort of classical anthropology or ethnography, will often use a lot of observational methods, where you try to not interfere so much with or guide or lead the research, what you observe, but you try to immerse yourself in a context and try to understand what, for instance, law means and particular types of law means in that particular context. But it can also be more structured, and most other social sciences will have a more structured approach to field-based empirical research. So you will ask questions. It can be through more open-ended and informal questions, or it can be more semi-structured, where you have a theory that guides sort of it might often be a preliminary theory that guides your research, but you have a more structured approach to which types of respondents you need to have materials from, what type of information you need from them, and you will sometimes want to ask the same kind of questions to different respondents so that you can get the different points of view on the same issue in all the different contexts that you're going to research. So because you want to know something not only about one particular context, but you also want to say something about how that is relative to others. So so if you go sort of further on that, you can go sort of towards a survey. So there is this sliding scale, if you want, from open-ended interviews or observation, where you just engage or observe a particular context through informal, open-ended questions, through more social, the more structured interviews to a survey, where you can have, often you will then have pre-recorded categories, but you can also have, and increasingly there are open-ended categories where you ask the same questions and you get either written or oral sort of qualitative answers within questionnaires. So this is a sliding scale, which means that in some cases it's qualitative in the sense that you go in and you interpret and you analyze it in a more you don't sort of you analyze it in a more interpretative and contextual way, and you're interested in each respondent, not necessarily the representativeness of it, but in its own grounds and its own importance, in order to look at different types of responses to a question. While if you go to a survey, you are interested, you want to see to what extent, so how common, for instance, a particular type of response is, and how it is linked to other variables, such as it could be nationality if it's a cross-national context survey, or it can be gender, or it can be indigenous background, or there can be you want to sort of understand structures in the material, but then you already need to have a theory about how different variables are related. So this is for me the most basic. No, I'm going to use that. I was told that I needed to have this. So this is sort of one basic way of understanding in field-based research the relationship between qualitative and quantitative research. So it's not as if they're fundamentally different, and it's not as if the logics necessarily are fundamentally different, but there are some differences in the sense that with the qualitative research, we're mainly interested in understanding a particular context in its complexity, and to understand issues of interpretation and meaning in a particular context, while in quantitative research, we're more interested in understanding issues around how representative a phenomenon is, or an understanding is, and how it's linked to other types of factors how it links to other kinds of variables. So which is also why, particularly in early multi-method research, we would often think about it as stages. So either you would go in, if you had little previous knowledge about a field, you would also often go in with for instance, ethnographic research or other types of qualitative research to try and get the sense of the field. You would try to get a sense of how the dynamics were around the particular issues. For instance, it could be around the right to water. You would go in and you would try and get a sense of it. And once you sort of had a sense, you developed an hypothesis about how the issues were playing out on the ground, you would conduct a survey to see whether this was actually the case, whether what you find is only in this particular, only with the people that you spoke to, or if it's something that also is representative of the whole population. Because the strength of qualitative research would be that you will be able to engage over repeatedly and thickly, in a thick way, with a particular context. So you would be quite sure that what you get is actually what is going on in that particular context. But since you can only research a certain group or a limited community or a couple of places, it's difficult to know whether this is the case elsewhere or if this holds up for other parts of the population, which is why you often would try and do both. You would try to sort of get a sense of the particular context, and then you would try to see if it holds up in more quantitative research. The same, sometimes it's the other way around. You have survey research that some of you engaged in, and then you find interesting connections, but you don't really know what they mean. I mean, sometimes you think that you know what they mean, but sometimes you're surprised and you don't know why this is. You can see that, for instance, I mean, you were researching informality in the economy, but maybe you would find that particular groups have a very different attitude towards informality in the economy, and it's not necessarily clear why that is the case, which would then be in order to find out what causes this or why this is the case in a particular context, you might want to do anthropological research or other kinds of qualitative research into that context in order to understand why this is the case. So this is and these are all very common methods that are applied to in social science generally, but also to issues of human rights. And then of course I put that further down. Then of course I'm not going to talk about that. But of course in human rights there are also a lot of doctrinal work that sometimes are integrated into, and that we try to integrate sometimes in different ways, also into the qualitative in particular methods. But then what has been happening particularly over the last decade is that the methods development, there has been a development of new types of methods into the social sciences. So one type of research that is more common, and that I'll come back to, and that we also do in some of our projects, is experimental research. Have any of you been involved in that at all? No. So it's often part of surveys. So that's maybe the easiest way to explain it. It comes, of course, the idea behind the problem with quantitative methods is that you can't really say anything about what causes what. Very often you can just see that there is a covariation, that it's there at the same time. And there is a challenge of really knowing what causes what. So for instance, in the area of law, one of the things that we're really interested in is whether to put a law in place changes attitudes, or whether a ruling in a case changes attitudes. That's something that we, in a way, assume, and law assumes that there is a normative effect of putting in place a law that will change behavior, but also that it changes attitudes. But it's hard to really know. And of course, we can try and see whether there is a covariation over countries of places where there is a particular law in place and particular types of attitudes and behaviors, but we don't really know what caused what, or whether both of it is caused by trends, deeper trends that both sort of develops law and develops behavior and norms. So one of the ways in which we then try to probe the issue of the effect of law are through experiments, and when this is done in surveys. So, do any of you have any idea of how could you do this through an experiment? No. So the idea of an experiment from a laboratory is, of course, that you keep everything the same except for the one thing that you think makes a difference. Mm-hmm. You only vary one thing. So what you will then do in an experiment is that you would, for instance, say you would ask people, we did, this is an experiment that I did with a student some years back. Norway was about to pass a new law on legal gender, change of legal gender. Norway used to have a very conservative position on the use of on the change of legal gender. You had to actually have surgery and a diagnosis in order to change legal gender. And then there was a proposal to change the law to a very liberal, that if you were above 16, you could just decide. You didn't have to have a diagnosis, or you didn't have to have any surgery or any treatment. So there was a change of law. There wasn't really much debate on this in the public sphere. So we did an experiment. So what we did was that we divided the survey group, into four different groups. So one of the group was just asked, what do you think should be the criteria for changing legal gender? And then they got many different different options that are out there, basically, including the new one that Norway had and the old one, and then everything in between. Then there was one group who was asked, was giving what we call a vignette, a small story before you ask the question. And in that story, they got information about what the law was at the time, which was the very restricted law. Another group got information about the new law that was being proposed. And then there was one group who had information about some other countries, but it's particularly the three that are interesting. So what we did here was that we asked the same question to everyone, but some of them had some additional information, which was information about the law. So we were interested in whether knowing what the law was or knowing what the proposed law was would change people's attitudes. And in this case, we found that it really did. So first, we found that when asked with no probe whatsoever, most people favor the most liberal, what would be the new law option. So that was what majority favored. But when people were informed about what the law was, which was much more conservative, that shifted attitudes towards a much more conservative position. So the group that had that information was much more conservative, while the group that got information about what the new proposed law was a lot more congregated a lot more on that position. So of course, there are many things that can be discussed about experimental setups and so on, but this is a way, a logic that is used in surveys, but also in other ways, to try and see to what extent law, in this case, and in most of our research, to what extent law makes a difference to how, or court rulings make a difference to how people are, people's attitudes towards a particular question. So that's of course, it comes from, I mean, you're an economist, so it comes from development economics, or it comes from the natural sciences, but it comes into social science a lot via development economics and also psychology. Then there are also, so in addition to the qualitative methods that are mainly fieldwork, but that also can be studying literature or film or artifacts and sort of an interpretative, and the qualitative methods that are usually surveys, but doesn't necessarily have to be, but it can also be sort of analysis of statistics that are gathered from statistical bureaus, which we underuse a lot, but that are, and for all different purposes. And these experiments, there is an increasing use of what is called computational methods. Do any of you know what computational methods would be? No. So, but most of you would know that there are a lot of people are concerned with big data. Yeah. So, which basically means that you go in and you use the power of, you gather data often from the internet in different ways, and you use sort of data, you use automatic reading of the data and gathering of the data and analysis of the data which means that while quantitative methods start with an hypothesis and purposively go out and gather data based on the questions, in many cases computational methods will sort of you'll release the machine, if you want, into a material, and they will then come up with patterns that are not premised on at least with unsupervised methods, that are not necessarily premised on assumptions at the outset. And there are, I think some of this was extremely fascinating, and a lot of people have used it for different things, and it is useful for a lot of things. For instance, what we've done in quite a lot of our research is to look at quite large media data sets, to try and understand what the public discourse around an issue was at particular points in time when it was a hot issue in the media, for instance, to try and understand to do sort of topic modeling or try to understand the sentiment of the debates and at various stages. And you can also use the methods to look at networks between different types of actors and different groups. So these are, but this is a quite. There are different types of computational methods and different uses, but these would be sort of the main types of methods that are, in addition to sort of doctrinal work, are used to try in empirical legal research and in research around human rights. Does this make sense so far? Any questions? Okay, so then I thought I would start with just asking you to help me with this. Okay, so I don't know why okay. So then I'm going to put to you some of the research that we've done, and then I thought I would ask you to discuss a little bit two and two between yourselves, and then come up with some suggestions. So we had this big research project on the right to health. What we see in many parts of the world, and what we've some of you are from Brazil, and also from Colombia. Colombia and Brazil are two of the countries where the highest number of court cases on the right to health go to court. I mean, where hundreds of thousands of people go to court to demand the right to health, their right to health, or the right to treatment. And this creates sort of this of course is a political concern, and it has created a lot of debates in the countries. But also from the perspective of research, it raises a lot of questions. So, is this a good thing from the perspective of the right to health, that people can go to court in large numbers to demand the right to health? Does it advance justice in health, or does it do the opposite? So that was the question that we started out with, because in some cases this came out as we were investigating other cases around social rights litigation, and then we see that there was a huge and rising amount of cases on the right to health, and often it is a demand for really expensive treatment for very serious conditions. So it's a life-threatening condition, and there is a treatment, and you're denied a treatment for reasons of cost usually, and then you go to court, and then the court will usually give you the claim. So that was sort of the starting point. So the question is, has this judicialization of health brought more justice in health? So if you want to investigate that empirically, what would you do? So just 3 or 4 together, just sit and talk for a couple of minutes, and then give me some. I'll give you or maybe I won't give you the setup of the group first. I'll just let you ask. Think.
administration responses. Second of all, what do you mean justice in health? So which treatments, access, because in Spain some people doesn't have the legal paper to go to the doctor, so it's not only the treatment, it's also the access, also it's the speed, how fast do you get there, and from that I will go to a more social, legal social point of view, which will be number of cases, resolution, difficultness to get those cases solved, like if your case was in a peace or whatever, and far more social point of view, which is the real application of those cases. Because for in Spain we have like a law that rules the caring of elder or people who is not able to help themselves. So there's a law that recognizes that the people who have them should have some rights, should have some protection. There is law exists. There is some recognition of helping this person. You deserve these protections, but there is no money. So you have the right recognized by a paper of but there is no precedent model to help us. So the implementation from the real to the social point of view. So from a very legal point of view to the what the health is happening in a reality, I have like almost everything set up in a very legal point of view, which of course needs to be nourished in all these points of view which I don't have.
So I'm going to cut you off. I know that there is no way that you can have answered this in the. It's a super. I mean, we used 5 years to do this. So, but we didn't. I mean, and of course we didn't do all. But I just wanted you to activate your thinking. But I also want to hear from you. So maybe I'll start with the group in the back. What were your thoughts on this?
Like, what do you mean by justice in health? Like, okay, then, sorry, I just was wondering, like, what actually means justice? Yeah. Okay, yes. Yeah, I just was wondering, like, what is the definition of justice in health? Because then, because I come from a quantitative background, and I was thinking of ways to operationalize it, and also the teachers were, like, the professors were talking with us about, like,
Costa Rica, and then we had South Africa, and we had India. So these were and then we looked at other countries, but these were the main countries. So of course the issue of, are these systems really comparable, was the main issue. So of course, Colombia had, like at that time, the highest number of cases. And of course, we realized that one of the reasons why Colombia has a very high number of cases, you would probably know why. Or how many people from Colombia? Yeah. So this group can now tell us why. So why are there so many cases in Colombia?
Because often the hospitals don't want to give treatment to particulars that have the right to do it, so they have to activate an action of tutela, and it's called amparo in España, in order to get the treatment. So this is a very fast mechanism, but it requires, like, for a simple procedure, to activate like a process.
So this is anybody else want to say something in addition?
And at the same time, because the privatization of the healthcare system in Colombia has made a lot of complications with the people, who are looking for treatment for a cancer, for example. That is the privatization of the healthcare system is making that a lot of people needs to go to courts for ask for medications and so forth.
So these are really interesting. Would you want?
Some clarification before we move into methodology. What on your dependent variables? So how do you conceptualize justice in your own work? Because is it access, representation, participation, empowerment? I mean, there's so many dimensions to justice, and it's such a normative frame that I'm just trying to figure out, how do we know what there is before we move on to how to judge whether we're there or not?
Yes. So we can start at that then, which was also what you raised, actually. And of course, that was the other. I mean, that's another. We can start there. We'll do that first. So what is justice in health? What does it mean that it improves justice in health? And of course, it can be all of the things that you said. And it can be, which is also why there is a lot of disagreement about whether this is a good or a bad thing and how we should judge it. Because it can be judged. So we did different things in this study, because we had people with different methodological and theoretical backgrounds. Maybe I'll just show that. So we had people with very different backgrounds who looked at this very differently. But sort of what I didn't say was that one of the starting points was that this is sort of just a coincidence, but my husband did a lot of work on priority setting in health, and sort of looking at health system reform from a systems perspective. He's a medical doctor, an ethicist, but he works on priority setting. And then the idea is, how do you get the health for the whole population with a limited amount of resources, and how do you set, given that you have a limited amount of resources, how do you set priorities in a way that are equitable, that are just, that it sort of gives, and that only answers some of your questions, but that gives some more. That was one of the perspectives that were informing the research. So, because the question is and this is true in Colombia, and it's true in Brazil and many other places, Mexico, that there are people who are working really, really hard to try and reform health systems, to make them more reasonable and rational in a way in their operation, and to set priorities. That's a big sort of international movement, if you want. And then there are people who are looking at the individual right to health and the justiciability. So the question was sort of, do the two meet? And how do they meet? And how do they sort of influence each other? But it is a very good question, and it created a lot of discussion within the group, because some would say that to only look at it from a systems perspective would sort of also in many cases just sort of assume that that it was a zero-sum game, that there are a given amount of resources, and that is not clear. And then it also sort of assumes that the system is working rationally. So, and that some of what the litigation is to push the system to work in another way. But but I think that it is interesting, the question of, in a way, you can pick there isn't the right answer here. There isn't one way of thinking about justice and health. You can choose, that's part of the prism. You can choose one, but you have to be clear about which you choose as the dependent variable. So you can choose to look at access, for instance, and who gets access. You can look at, but you can also look at it from what part of what we did, which is to sort of look at how it skews, how the litigation skews spending on different types of treatments, if you want. We'll come back to that, but I want to say a little bit more about this first, because it was also very, very difficult. Because as there are very particular reasons why Colombia had the highest number of cases. Now I think it is Brazil, but why Colombia had, and it is related to what you said, that you have a system where you have sort of you have a commercialization of the system with private actors involved, but still you have a state payer. We have most of the funding. So the government will fund a lot of the expenses, even though you have a contributory system as well. So that is one of the reasons for the tensions, that you have private healthcare insurance companies who will try to limit their costs. So their incentive would be to say no to expensive treatments if they can. And then you have a very open, what is called legal opportunity structure. You have a very open access to the courts, where the tutela can be used to get a very quick decision in a case that is about the basic rights. It's about human rights. So the court said that there is a right to health that is justiciable, and that can be sort of, that these amparo cases or tutelas in Colombia can be brought to get easy access. But it also means that in most other systems, those cases would not be constitutional law cases. Those cases would be part of administrative law. So they wouldn't come up as the right to health cases. They would come up as sort of administrative law cases. So there is a real problem of comparability. The other reason is, of course, that these are different systems in the sense that here you have a civil law, basically a civil law system, where each case has to be tried. So even if there are 20,000 similar cases, each of them are brought. While South Africa and India, you will have a decision, and then it will in principle hold for all the cases, so you don't get as many cases up. But they will be integrated, in theory at least, into the system in a different way. So there are real issues and real problems of comparability. And then, of course, you have different traditions and different incentives in the health system for universalizing the decisions. So in Costa Rica, for instance, where there is a similar, very easy access to the Constitutional Court, if there is this much more of a single payer system and less private actors in the health system. But in addition, if the state or if the caja, if the social, the sort of health system loses the case, they will have to pay costs to the court. But the private actor doesn't have to pay costs, which means that if the state loses 30 cases of a particular kind, they're going to universalize it and include it into the system. And in parts of Brazil, there are also a lot more tradition for including it into the system, which means that it is super difficult to research effects. So it's not only that you have to agree on, for a particular part of the study, you have to agree on which aspect of justice you're now considering, but you also have to take into account that these systems are really different. So it makes, in some cases, it's more interesting to look at the each case on its own than to necessarily always compare. But of course, some of the aspects of justice that we were looking at was the social gradient, whether the judicialization makes it easier, relatively easier for people who are poor, or relatively easier for people who are rich. And that is of course a very sort of, that's that's a very fundamental debate, not only for health, but for a lot of human rights litigation, that there is this concern that the most disadvantaged and the poorest will not get access through litigation because getting to court takes resources that are hard for poor people to mobilize. And then what is interesting in that sense is that the barriers of accessing justice are really low in these cases. You don't need to pay to get to court. There are public services that will help you get to court. The Costa Rican court will do the case for you if you bring a claim, more or less. So the access to justice is low, which means that in theory that shouldn't be such a big issue. But on the other hand, in South Africa and India, there are a lot more public interest litigations where a group will take a case on behalf of a disadvantaged group. And if there is a judgment, it will be universalized for all. So it might have an effect for poor people, even if they don't bring the case themselves. So this is one of the questions that we did ask, and where there is a lot of disagreement. And the researchers didn't quite agree. But what we, for instance, see in Colombia, and those of you who are Colombians will realize this, that there are more claims from people who are in the contributory system than people who are in the subsidized system. So the poor people will be in the subsidized system and have a smaller package of services. But there are more claims for people who are in the subsidized system, which means that, at least in terms of the value of the claims, which means that it's probably not. It probably is more useful for those who are higher up in the system. But this has been the subject of a lot of debate and a lot of research in Brazil, for instance. So that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is, does it distribute fairly between patient groups? So, and that has to do with sort of, there are many ways of thinking about this, but some of you might, if you have any knowledge of health economics, you might have heard about something called QALYs, which is quality adjusted life years. That's a way to sort of find a common currency between different conditions, where you say that the loss of well-being and health is in a way sort of translated into what is called quality adjusted life years. So if you live, you don't have a shorter life, but you have a shorter quality of life, you lose something. If you have a shorter life, you lose something. So it's a way to try and sort of find an equalizer between different types of conditions. So what we then try to do is to say, okay, so how many quality adjusted life years are gained by granting certain types of conditions, and how does that look compared to everything else in the health system? What else is given? Because what we do find is that a lot of the cases that go to court in all of these cases, in all of these conditions are, there are a lot of things, but many of them, and the most difficult ones, are super expensive treatments for really, really serious conditions, life-threatening conditions, but where the chances of success are quite small. So it's a marginal gain. It's really expensive, but it's also really, really life-threatening. And the courts generally find it very important, very difficult to say no, particularly in these cases. In South Africa, it's easier for them, which is also something that we try to understand why. But it is, and it makes sense. But this was one way of trying to think about it. So also another way of trying to think about health, which is from the systems level. So it means sort of, what we could say is that quite a lot of the cases of judicialization give a lot of resources to relatively few patients with relatively small quality gain, if you want, because it's relatively, there is just a small chance that it will help. But if it helps a lot. So this was, so this, from that perspective, it didn't seem that it sort of, to start with, is sort of, when you just look at it as such, that it brings more justice to help it might skew the system more. At the same time, in some cases, it brings in treatments that are, for some reason, politically stopped. So, for instance, in South Africa, the litigation around HIV treatment brought in a lot of brought in new treatment. It also did in other cases, also in Latin America. It brought in treatments that clearly sort of had a lot of health gain. And we, in the study, we calculated the gain in South Africa from introducing mother-to-child treatment for HIV/AIDS, which has a huge gain. So this is so that's some of the things we did. And but the project as such was no. So it's not this. I don't know. I think this. Yeah. So we did analysis where we most of it was structured case studies where we had a theoretical framework where we interviewed and used all kinds of materials for each case, trying to look at doctrinal issues of the health system, a lot of literature around this, interviewed key actors, but also did surveys to try and see who used the courts and also the type of analysis that I did where we integrated health economics, or to also try and look at it from that perspective to try and see the kinds of work. But of course, we ended up realizing that we were only able to do a little bit of a very limited concept and that a lot hinges on what justice in health is. And I think one of the things that was really that came out of the research for me was also that judges look at this really, really differently in different systems. So, for instance, then, if you look at it, some of the judges that we interviewed in Brazil would say, first of all, that the system can't be trusted. So even if we don't grant this case, it's not going to bring more justice at the system level because the system is so corrupt. So if we give this person this expensive treatment, it won't break the bank. It won't kill the aunt. It will give some local justice, and they'll squander the money anyway. So it would sort of be a very sort of the sort of lack of trust was very clear. But if you look at it, when you interview South African judges, they would say we can't grant. When you have a kidney failure, you need dialysis to this patient, because if we look at this in a systematic way, there are other people who have more use of this treatment, so you have to be longer down in the queue, and we can't be a queue jumping exercise. What we can do is that we can ask the hospitals to have clear guidelines for who should be selected. We can ask the provinces to have clear guidelines for allocation of resources, but we can't go in and change. We can check whether this patient is treated according to the rules, whether you're fairly treated within a fair system, but we can't go in and look at each one from the perspective of the right to health. So these are very different ways of thinking about justice in this case, but also very different because in the South African case, you know that is going to be a general rule, what you say. But in the Brazilian case, you know that it's just this case. And then it's very different, because then that person in front of you who's going to die unless you say yes has a very strong emphasis. So that's also sort of it's a difference. So I think in this case, the multi-methods approach made it clear. It's sort of where you both have the qualitative knowledge and you realize what moves actors in different contexts, but also a more detached quantitative approach gave us not the whole answer, but some of the answers to this question. Yes?
I'm from Brazil, and I work on the Defensoria Pública. Is there a public system, public, how can I say? It's the, is, oh my God, por Dios, yo estoy, my mind is blown, so 3 languages every day. And we work with the access to people. It's the people don't have to pay to access justice. I think it's not so common on the rest of the world. And we have a nucleo. I have a special place to treat health. And there are 2 elements that I think that is important for your research. Is there in this place the person has access to the justice, and the judge says the sentence in less than 24 hours. So it's very fast. Usually they say yes, like yes. And now they have a empirical group of medicals, and then they support their decisions on this group, because the judges generally says, I don't have this knowledge, it's specific, it's medical, and the things changed in the justice has a group of medicals. What happens is that we developed a mediation type of solution problems, in so things today they didn't always get to the justice, because there are a group of administration with politics in that, and they try to resolve before they get injustice. So there are numbers that they didn't get into the. Entonces, el principal problem que yo veo that I see is that if you are in the special cases, they are not like the majority. They are not like it's okay. The majority of cases is the social. It's basic health. It's not the highest cost. It's basic health. Entonces, what happened is that are 2 lists in hospitals, and this list is from the justice, and this list is from public health system. Entonces, if you think on the person, individual, it's justice, but if you think in the system, they are dividing the resources to these 2 basics.
Thank you. That's really, really important. What you're saying is really important, and part of it is and I think part of this development is happening many places where the judiciaries are trying to link up to medical expertise in a more coherent way. Because what happened when we started this research around 2008, then it was like whatever the doctor says, basically in most places, which has changed. So there is a lot more integration of scientific research. And that is what we also find. So there are different types of cases and again, sort of talking to different types of justice conceptions. So there are a lot of compliance cases. There are a lot of cases where people are asking for things that they have the right to anyway. And that's what you were saying as well. And that is a main driver of cases also in Colombia. It's the compliance cases where people have, so these cases make the system work better in a way. At the same time, they're like a safety valve. So because you have this option, the system doesn't really need to shape up, which is also why in Colombia there was a big decision saying that the system has to change. Because all of these cases can't come into the judiciary. You have to have an internal system that makes the system work. And that is why I'm saying that in most other more usually these are not constitutional cases, but all the health systems need mechanisms to make sure that the system complies with its own rules. So that is partly what this does. It is compliance with rules cases. And then there are these cases where the question is whether things that are not sort of part of the rules, that are not granted as within the system as it is, whether that should be included or not. And these are cases that we don't get them in the courts in Norway, but we get them in the media. And these are the same types of treatments that you wouldn't get in Norway. It's sort of the same issue. It's the same medications that come up. It's the same treatments that come up everywhere. So, and then the question is, how can you? And these are the problems for that. These are the questions that are politicized, because everybody wants, in a way, except for maybe the health insurance companies, want the compliance cases, because you want the system to function, but you do, and some of it is about malfunctioning in other ways. It's about corruption. It's about being slow. There are many sort of compliance, different types of compliance cases. So for sure, there are a lot of the judicialization that is positive, also from that perspective. But then there are these questions that I talked about, where the question is, if you include them, does it make the system more or less just, in a way, sort of? But then there is another perspective on justice, which is that health systems are basic institutions in society. In many cases, it is maybe the most important institution of the state that you interact with as a citizen. It could be schools, but it is a very important phase of the state. And that sort of having this possibility to interact that you have when the threshold is quite low, and sort of a possibility for being heard, that there is a value, and that it's a way to get justice in health that might not be about health service delivery, but that might be about participation and voice. And I think that is also what was said earlier. So and of course, if you look at it from that perspective, the more the better, in a way, because it creates a possibility for voice. So one of the reasons why I brought up this project, and I'm sure we've used way too much time on it, but one of the reasons why I brought it up is that this is one of the projects that has all of these, that looks deceptively simple. When you start, it's a simple question: is this good or bad? And then you realize that it's not simple at all when you try to think about what it actually means within one context, but also across contexts. And it's a question that we really need to know, in a way. So we need to sort of, this is a phenomenon that's there. So all societies need to understand how to relate to this phenomenon. So we need to ask the question, but at the same time, it's very difficult to answer because it's actually many, many, many questions. Did you have a? Okay. Okay, good. So let's go. I'm not getting through, but I'll take some of the other ones. Okay. So now I'm not going to try to do the staggered one. But so we also have a project on the right to water. So I thought I would bring that, since it's sort of in the terrain where you are, and some of you know about it already. So this is also to start with a really simple question. It's a very simple question, actually. So what the project asks is, so there was an international recognition of the right to water in 2010. So did it make a difference? Did it make a difference to how people mobilize for the right to water? And particularly, I mean, the idea with the right to water and sanitation was to give more emphasis to poor and vulnerable groups access to water in a situation with more and more water scarcity and competition. So did it help poor people access to water or mobilization around water? So that's the question. So what should we do to find out? Now you can know. So we have lawyers there, political scientists, we have psychologists, we also have some economics expertise. So what do you think we should do? This we're still doing, so we can take your advice. So you can go back 2 minutes in the groups, and then you can give me some good advice.
la vida cotidiana.
viviendas, en las comunidades. Eso no tiene una repercusión. El derecho como campus no tiene potencia fáctica. Y es lo que vemos en esta pregunta y lo que vemos en la otra pregunta. El que se determine algo en el derecho no le da potencia fáctica en la revisión comunitaria. Y claro, en este momento, en los últimos 100 años ya se escribieron todos los códigos disciplinarios, todos los códigos civiles, todas las leyes de protección del medio ambiente.
So again, I'm going to cut off the good discussions. I'm sorry, but now I really hope, with all this expertise, that you'll help us out. So maybe I'll start with the. Maybe I'll start.
Thank you. I will try to be brief, very brief. The law is just a literary genre. El derecho es solo un género literario. Eso por favor no lo pierdan de vista. The law is just a literary genre. The law is just a doctrinal maze to try not to sentence a not guilty person. The law is not a theoretical source of transformation. Just try to identify. The law just try to sentence persons. So the law don't have any factic power. We need to change the cognition and intellectual potence of the individual.
So what you're saying is that we shouldn't even try to investigate this. That's good. That's fair. That's fair.
All the codes
Yeah.
are written. All the laws are published and don't work. We need to change that.
Yes. So, and that is so that very good point, and I think it is. I think this is one of the projects where I think that we might have a problem of finding effects for many different reasons. But I think it's a fair point, and it's a good point. But I also think that literature has a lot of. I mean, I wouldn't say that literature doesn't have a potentially transformative power. I think literature. I mean, if it's a literary genre, I think it can have a way of changing the way people think. And thank you, because I also think we need to. That's actually I didn't say that. But I'll do it now. When we think about effects, we need to sort of also think about what we think about as effects. So in some ways, we can think about material effects. Did it change things on the ground? Did it result in new policies? Did it result in new laws? And that's one way of thinking about effects. And then, so one way of thinking about that would be to say, did the human right to water and sanitation, did it bring changes on the ground in terms of who actually gets access to water, in terms of new policies, in terms of new laws, and so on. When you say, did it bring sort of more piped water to people, then that's a very far causal distance, so it's quite difficult to investigate. There are many, many steps in between. But of course, that's one of the things we're interested in ultimately. But we're not only interested in the material. That's not the only type of effects. One could be sort of more political effects. Does the way in which who are included in the political processes when it comes to issues around water and sanitation, that could be one of the effects that we're interested in. Do the process of decision-making around these issues change, or don't they? And are new people, new groups included or in new terms in this? But we can also think about it in terms of what's sometimes called symbolic effects or ideational effects or attitudinal effect. Does it change the way we think about an issue? So does the fact that we say that water is a human right, does it change the way people think about the fact that they don't have access to water? Does it change the way the public discourses around water or scarcity and lack of water are being are taking place? We don't know if it does, but if it does, that's also an effect. And that some would say that is the most important effect, because if we're going to have any, and that would go to what you're saying in a way, that if law is going to have any effect on the ground, it needs to first change the way we think about issues. And that is when I'm saying that if you think about law as a literary genre, that's one of the ways in which literature and art very often works. It is changing the way we think about an issue and the way we see a problem and try to solve a problem. So I think if that is, and that goes for all our projects, that we always try to sort of differentiate. And I think this is how more and more research is trying to think about effects of law. And that is one way of integrating the more doctrinal perspectives with the more empirical perspectives, is to also look at this in terms of how it affects thinking. And I think also if you look at the Rivers project, it's also interesting because it engages with the way in which water and sort of right to water is conceived and thought about in different contexts, which would then be interesting to see whether knowledge about human rights changes and how it changes the things in different contexts. But so thank you. That was a very good point. Anyone? Any other comments or suggestions for us? This group had a lot of discussion. Would you like to say something?
So I represent.
Yeah, or yourself.
As I cannot represent this group, I will say what I try to give to this group, and was my idea that this question and the previous question was different in a core part, in which the previous question, the access to health, it's being health a right already recognized, and that people already feels that it should be recognized. It is recognized, affects the way people claim for access or justice in that aspect. This second question, the access to water, changes, in my opinion, diametrically, because before 2010 there wasn't a right for water. Maybe people had the moral or the ethical necessity for water, and they thought it should be a right, but it was not recognized as a right. So the recognition, even if it's international law recognition, which is not exactly a positive point of view, the mere recognition already changes the way people can claim the access to that right and the political discourse after that right. Because the question about the health rights would be about the application of a right already recognized, and this debate would be about how it should be recognized and then implemented. So this water has like a double question we should answer.
So this is really, really interesting. I think, first of all, the right to water is not, no, the right to health is very often not recognized. So, for instance, in many of the, I mean, over time maybe, but most of the cases where, like India, but also Colombia initially, and Costa Rica, and it's the right to life, and the right to life with dignity, and then you derive the right to health, and the right to water, and a lot of other things from that right. And actually the interesting thing is that the cases where it's most expansive, the right to health jurisprudence, is cases where it's not explicitly recognized. In South Africa, for instance, where it's recognized explicitly, it is also done in a bounded way, where it says within, to be progressively realized within available resources, which means that it's much more constrained. So that is actually interesting. When it comes to the right to water, it was actually recognized in quite a few constitutions before 2010. And our really poor job of putting together this project means that, in fact, most of the countries that we have in our universe recognized it in jurisprudence, and sometimes in constitutions, but at least in jurisprudence before, as part of the right to life, before 2010. And also many countries, but we didn't really know when we put it together, We learned after, but we didn't think about it as that, I guess. But also the international law would recognize it implicitly as part of some other treaties, and also the general comment from 2002. So we actually it is actually a poorly designed project, because 2010 wasn't really that much of a turning point. So we're trying to work around that, but it is still interesting. So we do different things. But one of the so actually in many of these cases there was already litigation on the right to water. For instance, in South Africa before 2010, and more often less afterwards, and it's actually quite interesting that it's not. I mean, so maybe it's more interesting to understand how South African jurisprudence influenced the international right to water and sanitation, and how the Indian jurisprudence influenced it. That influences, that's interesting. But still, I mean, we do look at different things. For instance, whether constitutions that get the right to water after 2010 are different from the few that had it before, but there are many more afterwards. But also whether the discourses around the constitutions relate to the international right and the processes around the international right. So and then there are a lot of sort of more in-depth court case studies trying to look at how the discourses around the right to water in the different cases. But it is, and also sort of trying to look at the sort of corpus of litigation in the different cases. I guess our time is up. Yeah. Okay, I could have spent the rest of the day with you discussing the rest of the problems. But thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts with me.
Thank you, Siri, for opening up this seminar cycle on empirical dialogue and human rights. I think you give us a lot of food for thought about human rights, how we can measure it, how we can implement, how we can think about human rights, its impact. Does it have impact, or is it just a political thing on paper, etc. And I also realize that even from the Rivers perspective project, that we still have a lot of things to think about, and how we're going to implement it, how we're going to research it, and how we can connect even with your ongoing project on the rights to water. So I'm also really happy to see this mixture of participants. So we have master's students, we have PhD students, we have postdoctoral students, even some professors came. So that's a really nice environment to get in a dialogue, because that's actually the goal of the objective of this kind of seminar. So you're really welcome next month with the seminar on transitional justice and Gacaca and Rwanda. We're going to delve into more empirical, long-term work on the ground, using mixed methods, but also life stories with victims and perpetrators of the genocide in Rwanda. And then in, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, we have the international launch of Rivers, where you're also really welcome to join the seminars that we're going to organize. And we also have a cineforo on Colombia on Wednesday evening, if I'm correct, the 6th of November, in the Museo de